You know what's much better than the Tour de France? Well, a pilgrimage in Japan on bikes. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about books, and not just any books. Today we'll be talking about the next Ian McDonald novel in our current journey through his general bibliography. And this one is Scissors, Cut Paper, Wrap Stone from 1994. We'll do the usual thing, which means I'll give you a quick synopsis, what it is, why you should read it, and yes, you should read it because it's brilliant. And then we'll talk about more detailed analysis and so forth after you have read the book. Trust me, you can do this really quickly. It's got like 100 pages. I'll have a quick sip of beer, and then we'll talk about, more nuanced stuff. In addition, I will go back and compare it to some elements of Snow Crash by Neal Stephenson, which I have made a video about last week. So either watch that one or read the book if you feel like it, because there will be spoilers for that one as well. But once again, these are 30-year-old books. I'm pretty sure it's fine by now. All right, let's get started. Okay. What is Scissors, Cut Paper, Wrap Stone? It is a short novel or a very long novella. It's kind of around that edge. It is set in future. Well, by now it's technically the past, because this was written in 1994 or published in 1994, and it's set in the second decade of the third millennium. So, well, yeah, in the 2010s, somewhere in a post-industrial, post-cyberpunk Japan. Two friends, vaguely European, maybe South African, somewhat like that, Ethan Ring and Japanese Masaiko are going on a Buddhist pilgrimage by bike. I keep forgetting the specific title of said pilgrimage. It's 88 temples in 1,000 kilometers all around the island, and they decided to do this on bike. Both have had stuff happen in their past that has certainly impacted their life, and they are doing this to maybe gain some spiritual peace and so forth back through this specific pilgrimage, even though they may not technically be active practicing Buddhists, but that's something that will happen later or not. So this is the motivation. They go through this, and they have to, face their past. There will be flashbacks about Ethan's past in particular. Ethan is the first-person narrator. So that's what you get. I think you should read this because it's a really interesting take on the cyberpunk genre from the mid-90s that moves beyond that. It is an emotionally really, really well done book and manages to pack a lot of stuff into just about 110 pages or so. It has three interesting main characters, and the way it explores everything is just like incredibly powerful. And yeah, as I said, it's a short one. What you got to lose, right? And it does, as I said, have like a lot to say about cyberpunk, about the 1990s, and how we deal with a lot of different problematic topics like power, technology, all of that stuff. And this being Ian McDonald manages to do so in an extraordinary way, in a literary way that is just stylistically really well done. This is an incredibly well constructed novel, almost too well constructed novel. So yeah, I think it might just be a very easy approach, or like first entrance point into McDonald's works if you have never tried one of his novels, because it is short. It does not go all overboard when it comes to his prose style. It is fairly straightforward to read, and I think it may be a very accessible first step into the McDonald verse, and that alone might be a reason to start the year if you haven't actually started any of the other books. So I don't know, go read it, goddammit. It's a really, really good book, and you should read it, and more people should read it and talk about it. So let's do that after I've had some beer and you have read the book, because as I said, it's really short. All right, I assume you have read the book by now, or you just really don't care about spoilers. So let's talk about different aspects of this. And we'll start first with what I will call historical artifacts, because I think it's just interesting to see this. And then we'll move beyond that. Historical artifacts, what do I mean by this? This book is written in the early 90s. And McDonald made a couple world-building decisions that I think are interesting to look at nowadays. One key part here is, of course, that Europe has turned into much more of a unified state than the European Union is by now, but it's certainly something that people in the late 80s and 90s thought might happen after the Cold War and everything, and Europe becoming fully united and everything. This is obviously an interesting part. A fun side element of this is, of course, that the 90s were also when the European economic sort of foundations were laid for what is now the Eurozone. But in the early 90s, the EU had not yet decided what to call their new currency. And one other term, or one other name for that currency that was floated at the time was écu. And McDonald obviously had to decide what to call this European money, and he went for écu, which is really fascinating when you read this book now. And I don't know, very few people may realize, or people that have not, been around back then or have looked into like European history or whatever, may realize that the term of écu for, European currency was a historical option when this book was written, and has just unfortunately not been chosen because, let's face it, it sounds much cooler than euro. But there we are. It's a couple of these sort of things that I find interesting that a lot of cyberpunk or near future novels in general face when you kind of you make your bets, and sometimes you get it wrong in some fundamental ways, which is, for example, that when you read something like Neuromancer, there's no mobile phones. There's no mobile phones in so many sort of like cyberpunk and science fiction novel from the 80s, because it's a technology that no one really thought about. And this book has some of these elements as well. It does also not have mobile phones. It only has people using like phone booths, which feels weirdly old-fashioned now, or anachronistic now, but there we are. Anyway, let's move on to the next part, and let's talk about what I mean when I say this is post-cyberpunk. See, cyberpunk in a lot of ways has been seen as, and can be seen as, a literary genre or literary tradition that started in the late 70s and had its first big sort of like success in the 1980s, and a lot of what we may call like fundamental elements of cyberpunk nowadays look still very 1980s. It's a lot of neon. It's like the things that you get in Neuromancer, that you get in Hardwired, that you get in those kind of books that you get in George Alec Effinger's Marie Audran trilogy or series of books, that all of that stuff. Obviously, you also get it in specific Japanese things like Ghost in the Shell and so forth. It's an 80s vibe that is very difficult to shake. And so the question is, what happens with stuff that happens in the 1990s when the sort of global environment, the global atmosphere, the global world that created cyberpunk and that gave rise to this specific approach to writing science fiction, when the world has shifted, right? The Cold War is over. We have reached what some people foolishly called the end of history. How to react to that? And we can see sort of like a first step in that happening, of course, in Snow Crash, and we'll come back to that later. I think it's interesting to see what Ian McDonald does with the additional, 2 years between Snow Crash coming out and this in 1994, and where he goes with it. So we have something that has moved on, and that means that certain elements of cyberpunk have to sort of be dismissed or moved away in other ways. And one of them is, of course, technology. Some of the technology that we know from cyberpunk is still here, right? We have people that have sort of sockets in their brains where they can put in language chips and stuff like that. Something that we can see with not so much with Neuromancer, but we can definitely see it obviously we have elements of that in Neuromancer. In some bits in the Sprawl trilogy, we have it in the Marie Audran stuff, and in other cyberpunk, the idea of moving towards a form of transhumanism. We have that. Another part that is very interesting is corporations. And there may be corporations in this world. There certainly are some corporations in this world. But the idea of the big, domineering global tech giants that we see in the Sprawl trilogy, or later in, say, Hardwired and stuff like that, has sort of moved on into different directions. And there's more of that. For example, archaeologies seem to be something that has come and gone, as we can see later in this novel. So there's that. The next important part, and I think this is what makes this book so interesting, is that it is set in Japan. See, cyberpunk in a lot of ways has a very interesting and somewhat fraught relationship to Japan, and this starts obviously with early William Gibson and moves on into different places of Japan sort of overtaking the United States and becoming its own global power in a lot of ways. And that is obviously somewhat rooted in, depending on which authors you're talking about, somewhat rooted in the general mostly American and Western fear that certainly existed up to a point that Japan might be the next global power. The idea of the so-called Asian tigers, with Japan, Korea, and so forth, leading in consumer electronics. It's certainly something that came up in several moments throughout the 80s and early 90s. But by 1994, that was gone. So, setting the novel in Japan, in a post-industrial Japan, I think, is a very specific, deliberate choice here. It also, I think, is a good reply because Japan is no longer that threatening thing. It kind of shows that the West was very capable, especially, Europe and the United States, as sort of like the Northern Hemisphere in that regard, and the West were more than able to sort of crush any full-on Japanese ambitions to become that global power, which is interestingly, shown in some world-building elements when people are talking about European consumer electronics, which are sold in Japan now, which is, an interesting take there. So I think it's a deliberate choice to set it in Japan, in a post-industrial Japan, to sort of react and subvert this idea of a powerful Japan that was certainly, well, not necessarily in cyberpunk, but in the general way that the 80s talked about Japan in a lot of ways, was at least verging on racist. It certainly is. It has elements of xenophobia, and kind of moving beyond that, I think, is an interesting approach that does once again add to this general idea of this being post-cyberpunk, I think. So let's move from there quickly to some other elements of world building, and then we move into the next big main thing here. Because Scissors Cut Paper Wrap Stone does the very specific form of sort of world building that is very clearly tied into the larger storytelling, something that you can also see in, say, Alan Hopkinson's Blackheart Man, and there's a terminology for that I kind of forgot again, which is a bit of a shame. I think Cory Doctorow has mentioned it in some of his texts as well. The idea of sort of drip-feeding world building information about the world throughout the story, and never actually going into large info dumps or anything of the sorts, which is once again something that McDonald does a lot here. And for example, the idea that we have, say, offshore arcologies burning. It's just like mentioned in the sentence that they can see the flames of another offshore arcology burning on the horizon, and you're like, oh, okay, I guess this is one of those moments where we can see that this is definitely cyberpunk, and post-cyberpunk, and not classic cyberpunk, because the status symbols of that capitalist order established under in cyberpunk Japan are clearly falling apart, and we have a number of these elements just coming up from time to time. The same with the technology that we have. Apparently there is a level of personality uploads which hasn't actually reached to full-on personality uploads, but simulacra of ancestors, which has led to a rise of a new technology enhanced Shintoism versus Buddhism in Japan, which is once again an interesting idea of how technology does intersect with religion, with spirituality, and in society at large. So this is an interesting part, and this is where we move on to Snow Crash for a moment, because spirituality, religion, technology sounds familiar, doesn't it? And there's a second element here that I think makes it even more important to kind of compare it to Snow Crash and to contrast it with Snow Crash. We can see one of the key technologies that Ethan Ring has access to, for a reason it gets, explained in flashbacks how he ended up with that specific power, is to use certain graphics, certain visual representations called fractors in this world that allow him to control, to bypass the brain's sort of higher functions and exert basically mind control, which, is basically the same thing that we can see as underlying sort of plot point in Snow Crash with a Sumerian language there. And this is just something I just wanted to bring up because it shows a very clear contrast. On the one hand, Stephenson goes for a language, which makes sense because he's a programmer, or he's, even if he was not like the biggest programmer in the world ever, Neal Stephenson always thinks about programming languages and that kind of stuff. So he goes down that very specific form of control, whereas Ian McDonald chooses visual representations, a much more artistic element. And I think this is important because what he does is his version of this form of mind control is much more emotion-based. It's much more intuition-based. It's much more artistic in that regard, and not about like very clear, direct control through language. And this, I think, kind of goes back to what I called like nerd science fiction in Snow Crash, where it is about very deliberate, very specific control through language, through pure rationality versus a more emotive human, I would say, approach to how humans work, because the underlying idea is that we function like basically like machines, or like something that can just be manipulated by evoking very clear and strong emotions. Those are differences, right? And that's the first part here. The second part, and I think the even more important part, is what happens with that kind of power if we assume that it exists. See, Snow Crash ends obviously with most people who have had the Snow Crash virus and have been made susceptible to the Sumerian language and that form of mind control, losing that through the power that is called the Nam Shabbat Enki in that story, and one person, Juanita, retaining it because she went through hell to get it and she's gonna keep it. Now we don't know what happens with Juanita and her power and so forth afterwards, because the book ends there, and I think that is interesting because here we have someone who has that power and is the only person, for all kinds of reasons, who has that specific power in the world of Scissors Cut Paper Rub Stone, and that is Ethan. And what we see immediately is that him having that specific power, even though he doesn't want it, he actually wants to destroy it and so forth, he's somewhat seduced by that level of power in the beginning. He gets captured by the system, in this case the European Union, but it's made very clear that if he doesn't work for the European Union, he would otherwise have to work for one of the other larger power-broking systems, those being, of course, the United States, Pan-Islam, or the Pacific Rim corporations, or not corporations, but like groups. So the idea that one individual can have extraordinary powers and, access those and use those and exercise those extraordinary powers is very clearly not how the world works. It's certainly how the imagination of a hyper-individualist libertarian future of a Neal Stephenson imagination kind of works, but it's certainly not how the real world works, because, we live in a society, as people seem to say. So we have a very different thing here, which is you have that power comes at a cost. Not just that power, but any form of being extraordinary comes at all kinds of costs of being captured, or constantly, systems of power constantly trying to capture those kind of people. We have Masahiko, who is obviously an artist and has invented a very specific anime, and that sort of level of fame does also lead him into trouble in a lot of ways. And obviously with Luca, she's definitely fighting it, but she also gets, bought out by all kinds of corporations and so forth, because being extraordinary doesn't actually mean anything in a well-connected world. So this is the next level where I think these books sort of differ, but look at sort of similar ideas in a post-World War, post-Cold War world, where, the idea of mind control being something definitely sort of connected with during the Cold War with, say, communism in a lot of ways in Western ideas, being shown as something that is definitely something we all systems try to use, and showing where that goes. Now, the third part, I think, is obviously the idea of the cost of power. Not so much the responsibility, but the cost of power. And what we do, how to get rid of that. See, Ethan has done terrible things. He doesn't feel like he has a chance of getting out of there, because it's very difficult to give up that kind of power. The usual stuff. On the other hand, Masahiko feels responsible for the death of his then girlfriend, which we'll see how and where that kind of comes up as well. So that's why the two do their biking tour. And we can see how there are different elements to going through this. One of them is the spiritual approach, right? Ian McDonald has talked about spirituality before in other books like The Broken Land. So it's clearly one approach of kind of healing the hurts of our soul can be found in spirituality, even if it's, not specifically religious. Ethan clearly is not a Buddhist, but, encounters with the numinous can have that kind of effect. And it's important to acknowledge that. And it's a very different approach to, say, Snow Crash, where religion is very clearly used as another tool, as one that can be measured and fully understood. So that's the first part here. The second part is redemption. Ethan clearly is looking for redemption. The question is, what is redemption? If you have done something fucked up, as Ethan has, somewhat at least, there's several ways of what you can do. You can use your powers for good. They still come at a cost because, they're that level of power, and whenever you exercise it, there will be other people that come up. Power draws power, as Stephen Erickson sometimes says. And he certainly learns that during this story. He does use his power for good, and even then, external forces, in this case, the Tosa security, which with its very specifically fascist sort of design, go after him because he becomes a player that larger systems will always try to use. So redemption cannot be just done by doing good. It has to come through giving up power. But giving up power is also not very easy. And this, I think, is interesting where the story ends with Ethan, with after having done good, realizing that he has to destroy at least some larger power to get fully free. In this case, he chooses Tosa Security because Tosa Security can kind of try to attack, whereas it is impossible for him to kind of, destroy the entire European Union. So he goes up, he has his last sort of like grandstand, his action scene and everything. He goes through that. He then literally annihilates his hands in fire and loses all of that. So he gets his final grandstand, he goes out in that regard, but then he still manages to give up that power. And that, I think, is an important aspect, because you have to walk away. You have to give up this your extraordinary powers, capabilities, and so forth, if you want to be left alone by the system. Walking away is not always easy, and the idea of the ultra-powerful individualist with all the special skills, your hero protagonists, just walking away and not having, every government of the world constantly looking after them is clearly ridiculous. So you have to give up the power and then walk away. And we have examples of that in this book, right? We have the priest who could have been like a Nobel laureate in mathematics, giving up that power. We have all of these sort of like layers of this, and this, I think, is obviously the brilliance of Ian McDonald, how he layers the symbolism and lets these things come up throughout the story again and again in all these sort of like characters showing up, giving up power, doing these things, and Ethan has to learn it, kind of the hard way, but he still manages to learn it. And the way he ends it up with that specific story about this specific Daishi and the rich person being reborn, he kind of manages to do that, but it has to come through that sort of like redemption arc that ends with giving up the power and not just becoming the good weapon, I guess. So yeah, I think it's a really powerful book. I think it's really interesting to contrast it with as a perspective on humanity, on how humans are, how humans function, and on our world, to contrast it with something like Snow Crash, but also as a take on, what to do with Cyberpunk when some of the key assumptions that led to the foundation of Cyberpunk have just been blown away, and where to go next. I really enjoyed the book. I hope you did so as well, if you read it. Let me know what you think about it when you read it. Let me know what you think about, something else. If you haven't read it, let me know if you want to read it. Down in the comments, please be active. More people need to know about Ian McDonald. And this is the project that we're currently doing. I will see you with a different video very soon. Until then, like, subscribe, join the Patreon if you feel like it, comment, share the video with a friend. Do all the good things. And until then, thanks and cheers.